Captain Subra, can you hear me?
Yes, Tim, loud and clear. How are you?
Okay. So let me call the meeting back to order. Tonight it's our second suite of experiences, sharing and learning and insights. And to kick us off, I am going to be handing over to Captain Subra, who is not only the General Manager of Port Klang Authority Malaysia, but also President of the International Association of Ports and Harbours. And we are absolutely delighted that he is able to join us. Captain Subra, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Tim. A very good day to all. Greetings from warm and sunny Malaysia. Yeah, you're right, Tim. The sun is setting in about an hour's time. Thank you for the opportunity to speak at this prestigious forum in conjunction with the COP26. We are really pleased to be here. My presentation today will cover two parts. I will try to briefly give some insights into what Port Klang is doing and in general what Malaysian ports are doing in terms of adaptation practices on climate change. And my second part will cover on the work of IAPH, how IAPH is involved in climate change programs and how they are working with members around the world to bring about the changes that is so much required. I think we heard from some of the speakers in the first session this morning. Very interesting papers that were presented. So I hope to do some justice to those speakers as well and try to give my perspective on the climate change in these parts of the world. Very quickly, a little bit of introduction on Malaysian ports and Port Klang. Maritime industry is huge here in Malaysia. It contributes significantly to our GDP as well. We've got over 20 major ports in Malaysia. But Port Klang by far is the biggest port. We are the busiest port as well. We did about 14,000 ships last year. And in terms of handling of containers, we did about 13.7 million. And this year we're expecting to do close to about 14 million. But our location is quite ideal. We are located right smack in the center of the Straits of Malacca, the busiest straits in the world, where there are a couple of other ports that are located as well. But generally speaking, if you look at the throughput for the whole country itself, we are not doing too bad. We actually are the number 5th biggest handler of containers in the world. So all in all, the port industry, the shipping industry, and the logistics industry is huge here in Malaysia. And that's why the topic that we're speaking about today on climate change is so much very important for us as well. Right. Very quickly on the climate change initiatives that is going on here. Well, the environment, we know the impacts on the environment. We've spoken about this quite extensively. But generally on the ports itself, it's very challenging for us in the ports. Shipping itself is quite well regulated. Thus far, I think over the last 20 years, a lot has been done at the international arena through forums and bodies like International Maritime Organization, where there are very clear guidelines, very clear regulations on setting the standards for ships to comply with the requirements of emissions. But I don't think we have that much of progress done when it comes to ports and logistics industry. That being said, probably it's because we are more inland based and we depend a lot on the national legislations and local laws and regulations. So on that aspect, I think more has to be done to step up those efforts, especially at the ports. and ports are definitely going to be impacted. We heard about sea level rise, though I must say in these parts of the world, Port Klang especially, we are a well protected port. We have outlying islands that offer natural protection. We don't have adverse weathers like in Europe or North America. And we hardly see winds exceeding force 5 here occasionally. But nevertheless, I believe the impacts of sea level rise will happen, and therefore even ports in these parts of the world need to be prepared as well. So on that basis, if I can go to the next slide, please. On that basis, Malaysia has set very clear greenhouse gas targets. Our commitment is to reduce the GHG by 45% by 2030, and hope we can go towards a net zero GHG emissions by 2050. Here in Malaysia, the initiatives are headed by the Ministry of Environment and Water, though the Ministry of Transport works very closely with this ministry. So there's several initiatives that are currently ongoing at national level. And this is, of course, driven by the National Climate Change Action Plan. The most important one is definitely looking at a domestic emission trading scheme. We're also looking at new energy generation and hoping that we are able to translate this even into onshore transport systems such as vehicles. And one of the important deadline that has been done by the government is to ensure that all government vehicles at least are on electric vehicles by 2030. There's a commitment from the government to reserve at least 50% of the national forest coverage. We are going strongly on zero waste as well as recycling. And the new cities in Malaysia that are being developed now, around the concept of low carbon cities. And a lot of emphasis is now being put into water resource management, looking at new engineering designs to ensure that the water supply is sustainable for the future. So on that basis, we are working very closely with many parties, especially the stakeholders in many industries, especially in the ports, to go into promote more on digitalization, reduce carbon footprint, as well as using sustainable resources and sustainable practices as well. Next, please. The Malaysian Maritime Transport Initiatives, basically we utilize about 40% of the energy within the industry, and currently the transport industry contributes about 30% of the greenhouse gases. So all the more reason why the transport industry has to work harder. And some of the initiatives that are already being put in place is waste management, looking at ballast water management, prevention of pollution, and also in recycling and reusing materials. Cleaner shipping and logistics industry throughout the supply chain is one major effort that is currently being undertaken as well. We are giving our support to the IMO's Green Voyage 2050, which is basically looking at reduction of greenhouse gases in the shipping industry and how ports can work together with the shipping industry as well. And we are also developing a blue economy where the port shipping and marine transport and logistics can come together to provide better solutions. Next. In Port Klang itself, if we start from 10 o'clock on a clockwise direction, we have recently replaced many of our equipment in the port, especially the container handling equipment, to more electrically driven, and we have completed the replacement of all the conventional lighting using LED technology. it is a requirement now where all warehouses that are to be constructed from last year will need to incorporate solar panels at their rooftops. So this will drastically increase our power generation within the port area. We hope to have a considerable amount of solar power supplied towards port industry and the warehouse industry itself. Another area that we are going into is the LNG bunkering. That has taken off 3 months ago. As you know, there are several companies, especially container companies, container vessel companies, who are embarking on constructing alternate fuel or alternate fuel driven engines. And we are working very closely with the shipping lines to ensure that the supplies are available here. I've spoken about the environment protection earlier, and that is something that we are preparing dedicated facilities to not only manage them, but also to have in-house recycling facilities as well. Generally, we have sufficient services to accept waste from ships, even from industries around the port area itself. The greening of the environment is something that we have been doing for a long time. We have been very fortunate to have natural green habitat around the port, but with the port industry growing, there is a major threat to the mangrove habitat around the port area. And we have taken upon ourselves to have more programs on mangrove replanting, especially in protected areas which are slightly away from the ports, but they are still within the port area as well. And finally, looking at future projects, we are, we have to make sure that some of the other equipment that we're using within the port, especially the trucks and the forklifts, they are all driven either by LNG or electrically driven. We are working with the terminals to develop a couple of tugboats to be driven by LNG as well. And for the future port development projects, we have earmarked some berths to incorporate onshore power in line with the requirements of vessels as well. Next, please. We also do a lot of work with our sister organizations such as the IAPH, APAC, the Port Authorities Roundtable, as well as the ASEAN Ports Association, exchanging information and from time to time learning from each other, sharing information, and trying to do the best we can. Next, please. Yeah, let me speak a little bit about the IAPH. The International Association of Ports and Harbors is actually a non-governmental organization. It is actually made up of about 230 members from 90 countries. The primary objective is actually to promote the port industry and facilitate global trade through sustainable development and harmonized practices. So that's the most important area that we work with right now, is the harmonizing our practices around the port. IAPH is involved at IMO level as an NGO, and we are involved in some of the working groups at IMO level, especially on GHG emission reduction. And currently IAPH has got 3 technical committees that are working very closely with our members as well as with our sister organizations. And we have these 3 committees that are carrying out the bulk of the work. And the one that is engaged on issues related to climate change is the Energy and Climate Change Committee. Next, please. So decarbonization being one of the most important subject right now, IAPH is working on the onshore power supply, where we are addressing a lot of technical and design issues, as well as compatibility issues as well. Working with our members in ports, as well as the engineering companies who are able to provide solutions. On the provision of low or zero carbon fuels, this is an area that, it's not so easy when it comes to ports preparing such facilities. There's a lot of investment involved, but more importantly, there are also a lot of safety issues when you're dealing with fuels such as hydrogen, methane, or even ammonia. But important thing is many of the ports have already got experience in handling them as cargoes. So we are banking on that experience for ports to provide solutions for bunkering as well. And we're also involved in helping ports to provide incentives to ships. We have got a scheme that is known as the Environmental Ship Index, where we have over 4,500 ships in our register who have already been audited, and we know their level of compliance. And this information is shared with some 50 ports around the world who subscribe to this service. And therefore, these ports are able to gauge the compliance levels of these ships and then provide incentives for those ships when they call their ports. And lastly, we're also working on port call optimization and just-in-time operations. This is a very important concept today when we want to overcome the undue release of carbon emissions. There's no point ships speeding down towards a port, and after arriving, they are being told that their berth is not ready. So it's better for us to exchange information with the ships, let them know exactly when their berths are available, so that the ships will arrive on time, saving on their fuel, as well as limiting their emissions into the environment. Next, please. Some of the projects that we have undertaken, especially under the World Port Sustainability Program in our member states, especially at the Port of San Diego, Port of Valencia, and Maryland, they can be accessed through our website. There's a lot of positives that we can learn from these projects, which are applicable to others as well. Next, please. We have several joint initiatives with our sister organizations, especially PIANC. We work very closely with them on climate change issues. And this is an avenue where we are able to actually disseminate more information to our members. Next, please. So looking back at the climate adaptation in ports context, the most important thing is, of course, we are working towards factoring some of this adaptation into new projects. I think that will be a bit more practical rather than retrofitting or modifying ports that are already in existence. But the most important challenge we're facing today is the business case. As I think discussed earlier, we have a lot of financial implications that need to be dealt with. This is especially so for small nations, emerging economies, as well as developing nations. And this is where we have to be very sure that these countries with their limited resources are able to build on the capacities, and this is where a lot of assistance programs are badly needed. In terms of port operations, we encourage a lot of close work with the pilots, harbor masters, as well as port operators to ensure that operational issues are dealt with on a day-to-day basis. So in conclusion, I would like to just highlight some of the areas that we need to work on. Next, please. The quick action that is required for us to address the climate change, I don't think I need to overemphasize. We've mentioned this several times. We don't have much time. I mean, looking at targets of the next 10, 15, 20 years, we need to ensure that these targets are clear. And this is where we have to be very committed, and the action plans must be clear for execution. The use of digital solutions is one area that we all can work on. We have seen over the last 2 years on the onset of the COVID-19, how digital solutions have helped many industries, more so the port and shipping industry. We are able to cope with a lot of disruptions to ensure that the supply chain was not disrupted. IAPH is very much also involved in most of the climate adaptation resilience work that is ongoing, and the technical committees are key to this, and we hope to continue with this as well. And finally, IAPH is open to work with many or any organizations who have similar objectives, similar aspirations in order to achieve our targets for addressing climate change. That is all. Thank you very much. We hope that you can join us for the IAPH Next World Conference in Vancouver in May 2022. And Port Klang will also be hosting the next International Harbour Masters conference here in Kuala Lumpur in June 2022. Hope to see you all then soon. Thank you.
Captain Subra, that was outstanding. Thank you very much. Not just in terms of your reflections about Malaysia and Port Klang, but also the the important role that collective bodies can take, because this is not a problem confined to any one individual port or indeed stakeholder. Now we're going to stay out east and move to someone else at the end of their day. So we're particularly grateful that we're now joined, hopefully, by Marika Calfas, Chief Executive Officer, New South Wales Ports Australia. Marika, can you hear us?
I can hear you very well. Can you hear me?
Coming through loud and clear, Marika. The floor is yours.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be addressing you today on this very important topic. As introduced, my name is Marika Calfas. I'm the CEO of NSW Ports. I'm also the Australian representative to the PIANC Environmental Commission. What I'd like to do today is share with you some of the climate change risk assessment work that NSW Ports has undertaken. We first undertook a risk assessment back in 2015, and we're currently finalising a risk assessment now in 2021, an updated one. So what this presentation will do, will look at the changes that have occurred over that time to our risk assessments and the risks that we've identified, the level of that risk as well, and how they've changed over time, and some of the key actions that we have taken since the 2015 risk assessment. Firstly, before I kick off onto that, I'll just introduce NSW Ports. So who are we? We're the manager of 2 ports in New South Wales, Australia, one being Port Botany near Sydney, and the other is 90 kilometres south of Sydney at Port Kembla. We also manage 2 rail intermodal terminals, both in Sydney. Our ports handle a diverse range of import and export trades, including containers, fuel, motor vehicles, agricultural products, construction materials, and other products. So our risk assessment is covering the ports that handle, both ports which handle quite diverse trades. So if we look at our 2015 climate change risk assessment, the scope of that assessment was focused very much on our 2 ports. It concentrated mostly on the risks of climate change to port infrastructure. And the work also considered the adaptation and planning approaches to mitigate identified risks. Now, this particular piece of work was based on the IPCC 2007 data, as well as the Australian Standard for Climate Change Adaptation for Settlements and Infrastructure. The outcomes of that risk assessment are listed on this slide, and the key hazards that were identified were intensive rainfall storm events, the increase in average temperatures and extreme heat events, increased wind events and increased average wind speed, although there was a high level of uncertainty around the data and forecasts for this particular hazard, as well as climate change and climate change policy impacting on our actual trades, the types of trades we handled. Now, the main consequences of the first 3 hazards were on infrastructure, including damage to road surfaces and yard pavement surfaces, the drainage system capacities being exceeded, and failure of air conditioning in buildings and offices. Importantly, though, our assets were determined not to be directly at risk from coastal inundation due to sea level rise. But sea level risk combined with storm surge would exacerbate flooding risks, and it would also increase wave damage risk to infrastructure in the long term. No immediate action was determined to be required for the infrastructure, but the risks did need to be factored into our asset management plans and design criteria for when infrastructure is enhanced or replaced in the future. There were also some potential risks to operations identified at that time, particularly around the wind and swell impacts on ship movements, ship mooring and cargo handling. And as I mentioned, the data around that was highly uncertain. There was also the potential to impact on our trade volumes for climate sensitive cargoes such as grain and emissions intensive cargoes like fuel. But the conclusion from our risk assessment was that the anticipated effects of climate change on our ports should be manageable with current engineering and asset management practices combined with some adaptive practices. So if we look at what we've actually been doing since the 2015 risk assessment, a number of actions were implemented. These are just 4 of those actions which I've listed here just to cover different aspects of our business to give you a flavour of some of those actions. The first is around active monitoring and recording of adverse weather conditions that were leading to suspension of port operations, particularly pilotage, port closures and the like. And the purpose of this was to build a data set that could be used to assess long-term trends in the frequency and severity of events impacting on port operations. Because as I mentioned, this type of data wasn't available, it was very uncertain. Another action was to strengthen our Port Kembla breakwaters and seawall. This was in response to an extreme weather event post-2015. And we've implemented a 4-year monitoring program, which includes above and below water surveys to quantify changes to the breakwater structure and allow for more targeted maintenance. We've analysed the limiting wind conditions at existing mooring infrastructure, and this is of growing importance, particularly as vessel sizes increase and continue to increase. And the Port Authority, which manages navigation safety in our ports, implemented dynamic underkeel clearance technology for Port Botany, a system that already existed in Port Kembla. But this has already proven to be successful in increasing the port's resilience to weather events. It's allowing vessels to access the port during weather conditions that they may previously have not been able to access the port under. And this is due to the real-time data availability and the artificial intelligence forecasting that's used in the system. So now let's look at our climate change risk assessment work that we're currently undertaking. So this work is in progress. But what's different this time? So this time we're not only looking at our 2 ports, we're also looking at our 2 intermodal terminals. The work is covering the maritime and landside operations as well as infrastructure. Last time the main focus was on the infrastructure. And we are also looking beyond the port and looking at the connecting freight routes to and from the ports, including road, rail, pipelines and electricity connections. We're using the IPC 2013 data. Now, I should note here that we have about a 5 to 6 year time lag between IPCC data availability and its translation to New South Wales at a regional level. So we're always going to have that lag in terms of the data availability for our use in our risk assessments. And the work that's being conducted today is also drawing on our increased awareness of weather-related impacts based on our monitoring since 2015, as well as the fact that we've had a number of extreme weather events that have occurred over the past 6 years in New South Wales, which is clearly in the minds of everybody. Now, obviously, the quality of the data input is critical for reliable risk assessment outcomes. And when we look at the quality of the data going into our risk assessments, we can see that it ranges from good down to data deficient. In the good category, we have sea level risk, extreme heat and bushfire. In fair data, fair quality of data, we've got extreme rainfall and large hail. And where we are data deficient is in extreme winds and storms and swells and wave action. So that does not have good data quality. Now, here are some early outcomes from our 2021 risk assessment work. They're broken into two categories. The dark blue risks are those that we call existing risks. They were risks that were identified in the 2015 risk assessment work. The light blue risks, which are labelled new, they are additional risks that are being added as a result of this updated risk assessment work. When you look on the right-hand side, the arrows that are shown on the table on the right-hand side, they show the change in risk level from the 2015 assessment. So what you can see from this is not only have we added additional risks, a number of the risks previously identified show a higher risk rating in 2021 as compared to 2015 when we did the work. That's specifically around risks for swell and wind disruption of operations and wave damage to infrastructure. The only one that's gone down in risk rating is the risk of pavement damage due to extreme heat. Now, in most cases, the risk level in 2065 is higher than 2035. In the case, however, of wind, swell and wave risk, this could be an overestimate as we've adopted a precautionary approach. As I mentioned earlier, the quality of the data is not good. And so a precautionary approach was adopted where the likelihood of a higher likelihood of risk was adopted in this risk assessment. So it may be an overestimate, but as the data sets improve, the level of confidence in these forecasts will also improve. In terms of the new risks, these are new risks around long period waves disrupting mooring at some of our Port Kembla berths, hail impacts on some cargoes like vehicles and yard equipment, health impacts from exposure to bushfire smoke, incursion of new marine pests, particularly with migration of subtropical and tropical species coming south towards our ports as a result of sea temperature rises. Now, that is also one area where there's very limited data, and so we really don't have good confidence in the assessment around that particular risk. And the last one on this list is supply chain disruptions due to flooding, bushfire and landslip. And that's really focusing also on those connections to our ports. And I'll just talk about that a little more now. So this is, as part of the risk assessment work that's being done, we're also mapping the risk exposure of the connecting infrastructure to the ports. Now, this work is being done with by NSW Ports with WSP, so they've been engaged to undertake our climate change risk assessment work. And this is an example of some of the mapping that's going to be produced at the end of this process. This particular map in front of you shows road freight corridors to and from both of our ports at Botany and Port Kembla. Now, WSP are mapping natural hazard data, so flooding, coastal inundation, bushfire, extreme temperature and landslip, and that's being overlaid on our trade routes for key supply chains, and then considering the availability of alternative routes. The outcome will be overall risk exposure scores. On this map, you can see that high risk exposure is the dark purple colour, and that's showing that those road connections that are at risk and would disrupt trade flows to and from the ports. This mapping will allow us to have discussions with relevant organisations who are responsible for managing the connecting infrastructure to the ports to identify adaptation and or mitigation requirements. So where to next? Well, we need to finish the climate change risk assessment work that's currently underway. It's due to be finalised by the end of the year. But what we already know from the work undertaken to date is that we will need to continue collecting long-term data sets on weather-related disruptions and expand those data sets to include all port operations, marine side and land side. We're going to need to continue to build infrastructure resilience requirements into our asset management plans for replacement and delivery of new infrastructure. And we'll need to engage with the port operators and the supply chain infrastructure owners on the outcomes of this risk assessment work and the risk exposure mapping in order to show them key risk areas for them to consider mitigation and adaptation measures. And we're doing all of this as under a banner of also developing a new sustainability strategy in 2022. And I will leave you with some photos showing some of the extreme weather events that New South Wales has experienced over the past 6 years. And all of these are contributing to increased public and industry awareness of the risks associated with climate change. So I will conclude there. Thank you very much.
Marika, thank you. Thank you so much. Not just a fantastic example of a really rigorous risk assessment framework, but also a key point about, I think, that it's an ongoing exercise as that, the data improves, and also a very sobering reflection, seeing, how much worse things appear to have got, even in the relatively short period between your two sets of risk assessments there. So with that, we will move on to our next speaker, Regina Asariotis, who is the Chief of Policy and the Legislation section of UNCTAD. Regina, can you hear us?
I can hear you loud and clear. Can you hear me?
You're coming through strength 10. The floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And first of all, let me just begin to thank the organizers for putting this together. This is a very high quality event, and I think much needed. It's a great pleasure to listen to the presentations, which are very informative. So I hope to make a useful contribution. I think somebody has to operate the slides for me. So I'm going to talk about the topic I've been asked to present with a particular emphasis on SIDS, but I have to start with the global perspective. Seaports are critical for global trade and for development, but they are at risk of climate change. This is, of course, here talking to the converted, as it were, but it is important to bear the global perspective in mind, because that, to an extent, differs from the individual port's perspective. So over 80% of the volume of world trade are carried by sea from port to port, and ports are keynotes in the network of closely interlinked global supply chains. They're actually gateways to global markets for all countries, and they also provide the access to the blue economy. Globalization means we're all interconnected and interdependent, so there isn't any them and us, and we're literally in the same boat. Climate change will have direct and indirect impacts, and that includes, of course, those associated with sea level rise, temperature, humidity, precipitation changes, storms and floods. These are likely, among others, to affect port infrastructure and operations directly, but also hinterland transport and the broader supply chain, with a significant potential for not only damage, but also disruption and delay. And I cannot emphasize this enough, because in the broader scheme of things, this is what really makes this become outsized. There could be extensive economic and trade-related losses. And we've had stark reminders of this recently, not only with COVID, but also with the supply chain bottlenecks that we are seeing now in Californian ports, for example, or COVID, or even cyber attacks that we've seen on some pipelines, for example. So this is very important to bear in mind. And of course, these hazards are also going to exacerbate other transport-related challenges, including for small island developing states and other particularly vulnerable economies. And more generally, they're going to increase energy needs and also costs. I'll say a bit more in a minute. So climate change adaptation and resilience building for ports is of strategic economic importance, especially in the light of growing hazards. And you may be aware that the IPCC has just published very recently its 6th assessment report, which is very instructive and worrying about the hazards. But we've been highlighting this just before the report was published in a little note. I'm going to show you a little bit what we did there, among other things, looking at the risk for ports particularly. So if we're looking at the hazards for ports, next slide, please. The most important, next slide, please. The most important hazard, I think, globally could be, it would be true to say, is extreme sea levels. And what you can see on this slide here are hazard projections, more particularly projected changes in the return period of the baseline 1 in 100 years extreme sea level under climate variability and change, different scenarios for about 3,700 global ports. We did this modeling in conjunction with the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. And what you can see here on these slides is that at different scenarios, how much more frequently what used to be under the baseline, a 1 in 100 year event, would occur under climate change in different parts of the world where ports are located. So all global ports are affected, and the effects are worsening as the specific warming level increases. But even under 1.5 degrees, which we now know is going to be with us as soon as 2030, the return period of the baseline 1 in 100 extreme sea level will decrease to every 1 to 10 years in many South American, African, Gulf state, East Asian, and Pacific ports. And under 3 degrees, many global ports will experience this type of event several times per year. Now, that is particularly worrying because 1 in 100 years extreme sea levels are, of course, important design parameters for port defenses. Let's have a look at heat. Next slide, please. Extreme heat events are going to affect everybody in different ways. And here again, similar forecasts looking at the return period for 1 in 100 years extreme heat events. Again, all global ports will be affected. And at 1.5 degrees, so red on these slides is bad. At 1.5 degrees, the return period will decrease down to every 1 to 5 years in most of the tropical and subtropical settings. At 3 degrees, most global ports, except for some, would experience the baseline 1 in 100 years event at least every 2 years. Now, this has important implications for health and safety. We've already heard about the safety of people working outdoors, for example, at ports, and also energy needs and costs for cooling. Therefore, it's very important to bear in mind that energy efficiency, investment in renewables, and decarbonization will have important co-benefits also for adaptation purposes. Next slide, please. The hazards, there are many more, of course, but the hazards, including those that I've just presented, are going to have a range of impacts. And this slide presents some of these impacts by hazards. This is not comprehensive, of course, but illustrates the large variety and range. And if we now go to the next slide, please. The question arises how prepared we are collectively. We did a port industry survey, which we developed at the time with the IAPH, and we published the results in 2018 that raised information from global ports handling collectively more than 16% of global seaborne trade and is therefore quite representative. And that survey, amongst other things, revealed that although the majority of ports have been impacted by extreme events, there were important gaps in information available to seaports of all sizes and across all regions. That, of course, has important implications for risk assessment and for adaptation. Key messages we received at the time was that there was a need for better data and information, that climate change considerations should be mainstreamed into operations and planning, and that it would be a good idea to piggyback climate resilience when upgrading infrastructure and operations. And there have been other surveys related to transport and ports, particularly by UNECE, for example, and also by the Navigating Changing Climate Partnership. And I'm looking forward to the presentation by Brooke, who's been leading this effort. Next slide, please. All of this matters because of the timeframes involved. So if we're thinking of climate impacts, which are going to grow over the decades, and bear in mind that the planning of infrastructure takes a long time, there is an important overlap there. And then if we consider the service life of infrastructure, the situation is even more concerning. That means we have to plan early. We have to get going. Next slide, please. Now to come to the small island developing states. If we just zoom in now to their perspective, they're small, remote, and highly vulnerable to external shocks for a number of reasons. They're also very dependent on imports and face average high transport costs, much larger than global averages. Key concerns from their perspective are connectivity and transport costs, and the costs have been going up very dramatically, as you all know, just recently in the aftermath of the COVID disruptions. These countries face a high exposure to natural disasters and climate variability and change, matched or mismatched by low adaptive capacity. And In these countries, one cannot overemphasize the importance of ports and also coastal airports. They're literally lifelines for all external trade, for food, for energy, for the all-important tourism, and in the context of disaster risk reduction and management. And these critical assets are threatened by sea level rise and extreme events, particularly storms. And the figure you see is shows you ports within 50 kilometers of tropical sea storm tracks over a 50-year period based on real data. And you can see that the small island developing states groups, which are here in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, and in the Indian Ocean, are very significantly threatened. So for SIDS, climate resilience of ports is vital, literally, for their sustainable development prospects. Having said all of this, what can we do about it? So how do we go about it? Next slide. I think it would be helpful, or it is helpful, to conceptualize a little bit what we mean when we're talking about risk in this context. Risk is actually a function of hazards, exposure, and vulnerability. And therefore, what it means, if any one of these goes up, the risk increases. If any one of those goes down, the risk decreases. And some we can affect more, others we can affect less. But to understand what we need to do and where to prioritize, we have to assess these elements and assess the risk, and do this regularly. So exposure is very important, and that we need to do at individual localized levels. And vulnerability as well, which depends on the capacity to respond to the factors that make ports prone to damage or losses from hazards. And that includes everything from technologies and material to elevation, to human and financial resources, policy, legislation, and management. Next slide, please. So as concerns exposure then, what we did under a project which we carried out in the Caribbean, we looked at 8 ports and airports in Jamaica and St. Lucia, and among others, assessed the exposure to coastal flooding, marine flooding, under sea level change, sea level rise, and under climate change. And the results that we obtained, we did the modeling with the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. The results that we obtained were quite stark. So for St. Lucia, a very small tourist-dependent island, which you can see here, all the international ports and airports on which this country literally depends were at considerable high risk under all scenarios, and from as early as the 2030s. Now that's practically next Wednesday, and which just illustrates the urgency of this. We did publish these results in a peer-reviewed paper, and I'm glad to say this has helped to inform the IPCC 2018 and 19 reports, highlighting the particular problem for small island developing states, the exposure of their ports to sea level rise and extreme events, because there are very few quantitative studies on this. Next slide, please. In addition to the exposure to flooding, we also looked at operational disruptions. And bearing in mind that these countries have very limited capacity, we developed a relatively simple framework. This is, you can see the cover slide here on the left, which consists of a 4-step, larger step process that we think is helpful. And as a central part of this number 3 here, assess vulnerability, we've developed a very simple operational thresholds method. Next slide, please. So how does this work? We've asked stakeholders, and we can do this also, my timer, we can do this also based on generic thresholds, to identify thresholds. So where would operations be significantly impaired or disrupted? Then collecting climate data, relevant one, historical and future, and to determine the exposure to these hazards. So assessing current exposure and future disruptions. On the right here, you can see a slide which just indicates the type of hazards and exposure that one could consider, and to identify the relevant thresholds. That is very important to be done at the local level and with reference to specific requirements. But even if we just look at generic thresholds, next slide, please, we already can get some very interesting information. So under this project, as I mentioned, we looked at ports and airports, which in these countries are coastal. To answer this question, on how many days per year under climate change will the identified operational thresholds be exceeded. The results we got were quite interesting. So for example, for heat, even at 1.5 degrees, so very soon, staff working outdoors at ports and airports would be at high risk from the heat index for 5 and 2 days a year, respectively. That doesn't sound too much, but if you go further into the future, so the last 2 decades of this century, this may increase to 30 and 55 days a year for these locations, which tells you, or which tells the people in these locations, that this is something they need to factor in and plan for to deal with. In Jamaica, we found that Boeing aircraft would have to decrease their takeoff load for 65 days a year at the most important airport in the country for tourism in Montego Bay, and for 25 days a year at the main airport in the country in Kingston. And baseline energy requirements, that's very important for everybody. They will increase in these ports in Jamaica by 4% for 214 days a year, and in St. Lucia, 168 days a year, even at 1.5 degrees. So again, this point about energy efficiency, decarbonization, and renewables offering important co-benefits, especially now that energy prices are going up, and we want to mitigate, of course, and the costs are a particular issue in light of the impacts of the pandemic. Next slide, please. So action needed to adapt and build resilience very, very quickly. The operative word here is accelerate. So much more needs to be done very quickly. And a good milestone is that also highlighted in the transport and resiliency pathways, which we contributed to, that by 2030, critical transport infrastructure should be resilient to at least 2050. The pathways give a number of recommendations, and I urge everybody to look at these for different types of stakeholders, what people can do. We need high quality risk and vulnerability assessment based on best available science and data to improve the understanding of the impacts on port, again, at local levels. And this is critical to guide effective adaptation responses and also to prioritize resources. What else do we need, or what do we need for this purpose? We need improved data collection and availability, early planning with a view to the asset lifespan, adopting a systems approach, and of course, critical will be the need to avoid maladaptation, so to avoid over-engineering and staying flexible, considering also maybe smaller design changes, which could make a big difference. Mainstreaming, and we've heard that in our first presentation this morning from the Port of London Authority, effectively mainstreaming this throughout operations and planning is going to be critical for ports to understand where do these impacts occur. Funding is going to be important, and what we found is that smaller technical studies, which are absolutely critical to inform priorities, policies and plans and action, often aren't attracting much funding. There's not a lot of money, but funders tend to prefer information like, you want a wall built here, how high, how much do you need, rather than spending less money to do the technical studies, which are critical though, to do it well. For developing countries in particular, we need a great deal more of capacity building, and that includes human resources at local levels, education and training, and better access to affordable climate finance. What does that mean? Access means making it easier to obtain climate finance, but also make more funding available. And we know that the 100 billion a year, that there has been a lag on this, but also that this funding isn't necessarily in the form of loans, but also more grant-based to avoid indebting these countries further. Ecosystems approaches to adaptation are going to be critical and should be harnessed everywhere. And finally, maybe these points, which I think are often under-considered, successful adaptation needs to be underpinned by legal, regulatory, and policy frameworks for guidance, but also standards, guidance, and methodological tools. PIANC has developed very important guidance. ISO has developed standards for adaptation planning. So we hope to be able to contribute to further work on this. And more generally, maybe to end with this point, it's very critical that these considerations are effectively integrated in national adaptation plans and NDCs, which isn't happening enough at this point in time. So with that, I've come to the end of my presentation. I have a slide at the very end in case this is being made available to participants, where you can get links to some of our work. And I look forward to the rest of this seminar. Thank you very much.
Great. Regina, thank you very much. Really important, I think, that we consider these matters not just in terms of what it means for ports themselves, but for that wider trade resilience and indeed economic well-being, particularly for SIDS, but also I would suggest for us all. Now on our world tour, we return to the UK, both in terms of our speaker, but also our location. And I turn to my left to Jan Brooke, Marine Environment Advisor for the Peel Ports Group, but also the chair of the PIANC Permanent Task Group on Climate Change, and already been given a bit of a build-up by Regina. So Jan, over to you.
Thank you, Tim, and good morning, everybody here, and afternoon, evening elsewhere. So yes, my presentation today is just a canter through the guidance that Regina just mentioned that PIANC has produced on climate change adaptation planning. And I'm making this presentation on behalf of PIANC in my role as chair of the Permanent Task Group on Climate Change. And this is also part, again, has been mentioned a few times today, of the Navigating a Changing Climate Marrakesh Partnership Initiative, which is another reason that I'm here in Glasgow at the COP this week. So these things, I think it's become clear over the past day or two, some of these things sort of do hang together in a way perhaps that wasn't clear at the outset. So could I have the next slide? I'm not sure if this is working, is it? Oh, it is, perfect. Okay. So PIANC, for those of you that don't know, is an organisation that brings together technical experts globally to provide and produce good practice guidance for the navigation infrastructure sector. And recently we've published 3 reports, one on carbon management, one on resilience, and this one that I'm talking about today on climate change adaptation planning. Next slide. The document, which is freely available to download from the PIANC website. So if you're interested, I think if you just put in PIANC Working Group 178, that will probably Google straight to the document. And it sets out a 4-stage process for climate change adaptation planning. And I'll look at each of these stages in more detail as I go through. But essentially, the first one is to set the context, understand the context and set the objectives, then look at the climate information, assessing vulnerabilities and risks, and looking at adaptation options. So it's very much what many of the speakers here have already spoken about, but this really provides some guidance for those ports that haven't yet embarked on this journey about how you can go about understanding what the risks are and planning for that adaptation. So next slide. So the first step, and I think this is the one I'm going to dwell on most because it's the one that we've heard about implicitly, but perhaps not explicitly. And that is bringing together everything that's needed at the very beginning, before you start to gather the data, before you start to look at the risks. It's about understanding what is critical, what are the critical assets, operations and systems in your ports? How susceptible are they? Who else is involved? We've heard a lot about stakeholders, but there's need to engage internal and external stakeholders, not least to encourage ownership. And then look at setting the objectives and the data needs and so on. Next step. And I think here, we've heard a lot about interdependencies. Within the port infrastructure, within the port operation, we need to understand more about what is critical, what really matters, because very few ports, when they're looking at the existing port operations, the existing port infrastructure. So we're talking here not about designing new infrastructure, but actually looking at making your existing port more resilient. And what is critical? Because often you'll need to set priorities. How much adaptive capacity do you already have? If you're hit with an extreme event, where are the weaknesses? Where are the weak links? Or can you already absorb that shock and recover? And what is an acceptable level of risk? Again, that's been alluded to by several speakers today. Next slide. The second step in the process looks at establishing your climate information needs. So what is the baseline condition against which you're operating? What are the possible future climates, and not just one kind of estimate of what's going to happen, but what is the range, the scenarios? Because the best bet we have for making sure we can respond effectively is to have flexible solutions that accommodate all the different scenarios. And that data then can be analysed to explore to understand the climate change hazard. Next slide. And so here we're looking particularly some of the key considerations, looking not only at projected trends in individual parameters, but looking at extreme events and looking at joint occurrences, because often the worst damage, the worst disruption is experienced by the port when these things combine, when we have a storm surge on top of an already saturated catchment or whatever. Regina mentioned already the need to avoid maladaptation. You need to avoid making the wrong decisions. And because of the uncertainty that Philip mentioned yesterday, often that, as I said earlier, directs us towards more flexible solutions and to pathways that you build over time, as opposed to making a decision and implementing something now. And the planning horizon is important, because when we look at the climate data, if your planning horizon is less than 10 years, maybe you can look at the past as a guide to the future. But with the changes that are expected and with the uncertainty beyond 10 years, if your plan is for 30 years or 50 years, that's when these scenarios become important, because we don't actually know what changes we're going to experience, because that depends, among other things, about what happens here in the next 2 weeks in terms of reducing emissions. Next slide. The third stage that PIANC suggests is assessing vulnerabilities, looking at changes in susceptibility, looking at vulnerability assessment. In some cases, that's sufficient to inform decisions on adaptation action. In others, you need to look more detail at the risk assessment. So next slide. And the main things that the guidance sets out here, and the guidance has been prepared acknowledging that not all ports will have access to unlimited resources and unlimited finance, but maybe only to the the climate projections that are available online. And maybe it'll be the harbour master or the port planner or the port engineer that is trying to carry out this assessment largely themselves. And so what we've done here is said, what is the bare minimum that you need to understand? What is the bare minimum that you need to do? And risk assessment can be quite simple, and it also can be quite complicated. But we need to understand what level of detail is needed, and that will often be a function of the amount of investment and the consequence of the risk. Climate change can have positive as well as negative consequences. It can bring opportunities. We need not to overlook those. And ultimately, the outcome of this process may be as simple as a colour-coded matrix, highlighting in red where you need to act. Next slide. The PIANC guidance then provides some a stepwise approach to assessing what the options are. And in particular, it includes several portfolios of measures, both generic and impact specific, so that ports can understand what the range of options are open to them. It looks at the steps of deriving a long list and a short list, evaluating the options, developing adaptation pathways that we've heard a little about already, and then finally preparing and implementing the strategy. Next slide. And this is an example of one of the measures portfolios this is the generic one. And what the guidance does, it looks not only at physical measures, at structures, at systems, technologies and services, but also at social measures, so people, behaviour, operations, management, maintenance. And it looks at institutional support in the form of governance and policies and economics and so on. And so it provides this kind of snapshot of all the options that are available. So they're not all high tech, they're not all expensive. In some cases, small changes, keeping up with maintenance, changing operational regimes can actually make a big difference in terms of strengthening resilience. Next slide. So here, and I think this also alludes to something that Captain Subra said earlier, in order to justify investment in resilience and investment in adaptation, we need to understand the consequences of not acting. And I think the minister right at the beginning said that cost of adaptation can be high, but the cost of not adapting can be even higher. And the survey that was mentioned earlier is currently in the process of being written up, but that basically looks at ports from around the world, what their experiences are in terms of the costs and consequences of extreme weather events. So that's looking at damage costs, it's looking at downtime. And I think downtime is something we haven't really focused on so much here, but downtime can sometimes be the biggest impact of an extreme event as opposed to any physical damage. So understanding the consequences of not acting is important in justifying investment. I mentioned already a couple of times, innovative, flexible solutions. They offer the most benefit in this uncertain world. Prepare adaptation pathways, look at temporary or low regret measures, the low hanging fruit, because they can also make a big difference. When you're talking about retrofitting, physical retrofitting can be costly and expensive and complex. So we need to understand what adaptive capacity we already have in the system, and can we work with our existing infrastructure, our existing assets until they're due to be replaced anyway, or do we need to go back and retrofit? And also a small thing, but an important thing, is that conventional cost benefit analysis does not help when you're undertaking climate change adaptation decision making, because climate change adaptation decision making is about impacts in the future. And if you apply a discount rate that is too high, it reduces the value of those benefits. And I think multi-criteria analysis, for example, is much more useful than best benefit cost assessment for some of the climate change adaptation decision making when you're looking at this longer term. Sorry. So next slide, please. Final slide, I think this is on the role of monitoring. So this is looking at data management, monitoring, what information do we have? Because information is key to making effective decisions. We need to understand what condition our assets are in. We need to be able to develop real-time monitoring so that we can support early warning systems. We need to record the costs and consequences of extreme events, for example, because that information on the cost of an extreme event is what supports the investment business case to adapt and to strengthen resilience. Again, monitoring doesn't need to be sophisticated. It just needs to be fit for purpose. We need to understand what's happening. We need effective data management so that we can make just-in-time decisions. We need to prioritize maintenance to maximize resilience and improve adaptive capacity. And we need to recognize that adaptive management is key to dealing with these uncertainties. Next slide. So that's a very quick canter through the contents of the guidance. A lot of it we've heard from other speakers here anyway. And this really just, as I said, it's a guidance that helps those that recognize they need to do something but don't know how or where to start to actually make that progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Really great that there's actually that sort of almost compendium of what can we do that's, you know, that's out there and publicly accessible. So what I'm going to do is suggest that we do a very quick round of questions. Same protocol as the previous round. I'll take them in a group and then we'll run through each of the speakers. We are going to be, I think, a little, maybe 5 minutes over time, but I think the content and quality of the discussion has been absolutely well worth it. So please bear with us. Like a greyhound out of a trap, gentleman here with his hand up.
Thank you very much. Stuart Darling from ION. And maybe initially a question for yourself, Jan, but I'm interested to hear responses from the rest of the group as well. I thought it was really interesting this morning that Joaquin from the Port of Barcelona put up a statistic that basically showed that more than 2/3 of the emissions from the port were from the vessel side. And most of the discussion over the last 2 days has been landside around the ports. So from your perspective and from the perspective of the others, what sort of priority do you see on trying to address the emissions on the vessel side, on the water side, and the role that that regulations will play in adaptive technologies on the vessel side as they come around the port activity? Great question. So about vessels, lady on the left hand side as I look at it towards the back.
Hi, it's Rona from British Ports Association as well as IAPH. So just more specifically on fuels, so the presentations were clearly illustrated the impacts of climate change and how to evaluate these risks at ports. But when it comes to the introduction of fuels and particularly with the risks associated, safety risks associated with hydrogen and just the general operational changes, how do you foresee ports balancing both the risks of climate change and the challenges of introduction of new fuels? And do you foresee any new challenges emerging as a result of this?
Great, thanks, Rona. Any other questions or indeed anything online? I have one I would like to ask. So I'm come on, I'm here, man. I'm going to ask one, which is, in some ways, we are the converted, right? The fact that you're either in the room or you're online means that you do recognize that this is an interesting, important thing to address. So my question to the panel is, how well do you think the issue and the consequences of not addressing the issue are more broadly understood within your organizations and within your broader stakeholder groups? That would be my question. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask we'll run through the speakers in the order that they spoke for addressing any of those questions or any final reflections. So I will start with, if he is still there, Captain Subra.
Thank you, Tim. On the first question about the emphasis on vessel emissions, or whether we are going to be looking at shoreside emission, I believe both sides are equally important. Maybe emissions from vessels are handled with international regulations. Of course, national regulations are also in place to raise the standards of those minimum standards that are introduced by IMO. But I think they are both very important to be addressed because they both contribute towards climate change. On the balancing of the new fuel requirements in ports, I think I spoke about that. It is a major challenge, actually. Many ports are actually not prepared to provide such bunkering facilities. You look at ammonia, hydrogen. These are fuels that's been tested very little. So we hope that there's a lot of research has gone into this type of fuels, especially on storage and handling in ports. In terms of energy density, these fuels are not as good as fossil fuels. Therefore, there's a possibility that ships have to be doing more bunkering as compared to fossil fuels. How are the ports going to cope with this, as well as the financial investment that go into this? So I think there needs to be a lot of discussion on this to ensure that the ports are able to provide such facilities. On your last question, Tim, I totally agree. Stakeholder engagement is very, very important. Not just our external stakeholders within our own organization. I think we need to send a very clear message across the board, because the saying goes that good things start at home. We need to get the organization first to understand and ensure that the message is put across clearly. Thank you.
Thank you, Captain Subra. Marika.
Yes, hi, Tim. Okay, so I think I'm pretty aligned with what Captain Subra said. In terms of the ships, I think in our ports as well, we've identified ship emissions far outweigh landside operation emissions, but both are equally important to address, especially if we're all looking at targets of a net zero carbon at some point in the future as well. So I think each of them have to be addressed together. In terms of vessel emissions, I do think that ideally being led at an international level would be extremely beneficial rather than a national level. We have struggled with COVID having different restrictions in different countries, but within Australia having different rules across different states, and that's been really challenging. So anything with shipping that's global, ideally it would be driven at an international level. Fuel requirements at ports, I think it's a really good question in terms of what will be the role of different ports in providing fuel as well. At the moment, our ports in Australia, we don't do much bunkering. The fuel price is higher there than where ships can get it, usually in Singapore or elsewhere in the world. So it's not very heavily used bunkering in Australia. Will that change with alternate fuels and the use of methanol or hydrogen? And you know, storing it obviously does need significant consideration. We already store LPG, we've got LNG in Australia as well. So we're familiar with those products, but these ones will need to be looked at. We do have a hydrogen hub, hydrogen hubs identified across Australia through the federal government, of which Port Kembla and the Illawarra region is one of those. So it's certainly on our agenda. In terms of then awareness by broader community and the like, as you mentioned, I think that there is heightened awareness, absolutely heightened awareness. And in Australia, you may not see from what goes on sometimes with governments, but within businesses in Australia, more and more are committing to a net zero carbon target, typically around 2030, or some are doing reductions by 2030, substantial reductions by 2030, and then a net zero in 2050. So businesses are really leading the discussion in Australia, and I think, you know, any business that's not focused on looking at a pathway to net zero is going to come under greater scrutiny, not just by regulators but by the public. If I can just make one more point about the fuel, I think the more complex part of the discussion is actually the transition period. You know, eventually we'll get to some agreed fuel source, but I think the transition period is the really complex part of that needs to be worked through carefully. Thanks.
I think I'd agree with that. It's not necessarily the end point, but it's the road to the end point that's particularly challenging. Regina.
Thank you very much. I'd like to just echo what the other panelists have already said about the importance of both mitigation and in addition to adaptation, and that of course concerns ships. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to say more about this, but I draw again attention to what I'd mentioned earlier, energy security and costs. That's an important consideration that can be tackled also in this respect. How well are the consequences of not addressing climate change impacts generally understood? And I have to say, this is something I feel quite strongly about it. Definitely not enough. I mean, we've been looking at this complex of issues since 2008, and we're now 13 years down the line, and still we have to sort of highlight the same types of issues. And one of the reasons, I think, we're not talking necessarily about the individuals at the ports, but the broader community, including policymakers. In part, it's not really being able to understand what the impacts are, and this working in silos to an extent that we have heard about earlier. So climate change, the knee-jerk reaction is you're thinking of emissions, which are important, and you're not thinking enough about adaptation. And it's not enough understood that the impacts pose important business risks. And the World Economic Forum for the last few years has actually put climate adaptation and failure to take action and extreme events amongst the top global business risks. And there are various studies which highlight the costs of inaction, but it somehow doesn't register adequately where decision-making is concerned. So considering the time spans and the urgency of action for infrastructure on which we all depend, so the functionality of infrastructure for other processes, for global trade and development, there is really a much greater need for action. And maybe to conclude, the Hurricane Katrina, which most of us will remember well, was a very good example, actually, because you will recall initially some money had been put aside, budgeted for, to increase the levies, to raise the levies. And that was not carried out in the event. And then the 50 million or so that weren't spent helped lead to 100 billion losses and much human tragedy. So this is a very good example. We shouldn't have to wait for the problems to actually materialize in a large scale before we take action. Thank you.
Thank you. A very vivid demonstration or illustration of the cost of not taking action. Jan.
Yes, thank you. So I think the question about ships, I think, is not my area of expertise. I know there's a lot going on in the next 2 weeks at the COP about fuel for ships. What I would say, as Captain Subra mentioned already, is that the ports, though, do have a responsibility for facilitating emissions reductions where that's possible. And so some of the IAPH schemes, for example, will contribute to that. Fuels, I have no idea about, not my fact, but just then coming back to the final question about the awareness. And I think this is for me, that's the biggest challenge. That's why we set this event up here yesterday and today, because there are very few forums in which adaptation at ports has been discussed. There's been plenty of attention on mitigation for ships. There's more to do, obviously. Ports have a role to play mitigating their own emissions, but they're generally low. But I think this whole question about adapting port infrastructure, particularly existing port infrastructure, is critical. And I think the associations like PIANC, like IAPH, like the International Harbour Masters Associations need to do more to raise awareness among their membership. Because what we've seen over this last couple of days is that the experience is there. There are some ports who are taking action. Mostly that what we've seen also for me was really reassuring, because the steps that they're taking are the same as we put out in the PIANC guidance. People may do things in different orders or slightly different types of risk assessment, but fundamentally they're there. So the guidance exists, the experience exists, the good practice exists. And the risk is that people don't act until they're hit. And then we have a problem. And we've seen that, we've seen it with individual events like Katrina, like when New York and New Jersey was taken out with hurricane type events. We've seen it more recently with extreme heat, with flooding. And we've seen it with COVID, because the lessons that the transport sector as a whole needs to learn for climate change are not that much different from the pandemic. We need to be prepared. We need to prioritize maintenance. We need to make sure that we're looking ahead. We need to have contingency plans, early warning systems, and so on. And I think, as I say, all of our associations, those of us that are representing associations here in person and online, need to take more action to try and encourage ports to adapt and to strengthen their resilience before we find out the hard way.
Very good point. Now, so that's our Q&A done. I'm going to invite Gary Doyle from Peel Ports, the main sponsor from the event, to come and briefly wrap us up. Whilst he's coming to the stage, could I ask the people in the room and indeed at home to unleash a storm of applause for our excellent speakers all around the world. Thank you.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, firstly, on behalf of Peel Ports, I'd just like to thank the main facilitators. The main facilitators in terms of City of Glasgow College for providing the venue, Maritime UK Major Ports Group, British Ports Association, and Cameron Events. I was just about to say it's nice to go through an event where IT isn't a problem, but it hasn't been. And lastly, of course, I'd like to thank Mark and Tim for their excellent sort of chairmanship of the sessions and being able to do the herding of the cats so efficiently. But I'd also like to sort of echo what Regina just said and thank all the presenters for the quality and the thoughtfulness of all their presentations. I think over the last 2 days, they've been really good and provided some really good things to take away. So the question was, how do we summarize that day in a few minutes without the lights going out? And I'd like to start, I think, very quickly with the Minister's introduction. And I think his opening lines, the cost of adaptation may be high, the costs of not adaptating are even higher. I think that's a good theme for where we want to go. Adaptation resilience make business sense, and not only for climate change. And to echo some of the comments today, we need top-down commitment, and it needs to be embedded adaptation into organisation strategies and thinking. We need to recognise that adaptation planning horizon goes further than perhaps we think than our normal risk base, and I think we've seen that. We need to acknowledge uncertainties. We don't have all the answers. There's certain bit of guessing, but we do have a lot of knowledge on which to base our planning. Multiple solutions are needed. This is not a single answer. There's a load of things there we need to tie together. The importance of engaging with stakeholders around our communities, but also across the world. What we've seen for the last 2 days is there's a common trend amongst all of us as a port industry, and it's beholden on us to make sure we share those and actually work together. But we do need better information forecasting. How are we going to manage these sorts of things? We need to look at those. We need to develop early warning systems, set thresholds for action, and put there, all not rocket science. And lastly, for harbour masters in particular, sediment management is a key consideration, but it's also, as we've seen, an opportunity to help benefit. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've sort of taken those sort of key points out of the last day. I'm sure there's a lot more, but I'd just like to close. And once again, on behalf of everybody, say thank you for the most precious thing of all, your time. Wherever you are, good luck in what you're doing, and please stay safe. Thank you.